Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 27th, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's show, I want to thank those of you who support Talk Nerdy, keep it going, and offset that cost so that individuals who cannot afford to support the show don't have to pay to listen. I use the platform Patreon, so if you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit Patreon, patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Will Dufresne, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabo J., Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Joe Wilkinson. Thank you all so much. So this week I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Helen Pearson. She earned her degree in natural sciences at the University of Cambridge and then did a PhD in developmental genetics at the University of Edinburgh. But after that, she decided, SciComm and science journalism is going to be the way to go. And she actually wrote and edited for the journal Nature for over 20 years. In 2022, she became a senior editor for Nature. And then in 2026, just this year, she won a Knight Science Journalism Fellowship at MIT. So she'll be moving across the pond and hanging out with us in Boston starting later this year. She has a new book out called Beyond Belief: How Evidence Shows What Really Works. And without further ado, here she is, Dr. Helen Pearson. Well, Helen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited to talk about your new book, Beyond Belief: How Evidence Shows What Really Works. And I have to say, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart as somebody who was in academia. Now I'm more in a clinical kind of applied capacity as a psychologist in a major research hospital. But also for, the last 15 years of my life, I've worked as a public science communicator. And other than Talk Nerdy, of course, I work on a podcast called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And that is what we do, is trying to educate people about scientific skepticism, about critical thinking, and about why evidence-based medicine, evidence-based policy, evidence-based, fill in the blank is so incredibly important. So I'm so thrilled that you have dedicated so much of your professional life to this, compendium, we could call it, or to, this deep dive into this very topic. So before we get into the book itself, tell me a little bit about you. So you are a science journalist. How did you first get into writing, doing journalism and specifically writing about science?
Sure. So I started out studying science. I studied genetics at university, and I did go on and do a PhD in developmental genetics. So I was kind of dissecting mouse brains and, did all of that kind of detailed research and got a taste of the lab. And I think doing that made me realize that although I enjoyed it and I loved science, I didn't really want to dedicate myself to one very specialized area of science. I'm not sure I had the passion to commit to that area because I really love seeing the big picture. That the most amazing thing about what I do is being able to just go deeply into one topic for a month and then move on to something else. So I guess I had that kind of intellectual restlessness, shall we say. And so after doing the PhD, I actually went to work for a while in the Science Museum in London, and I was starting to do a bit of kind of freelance writing. And then this beginner reporter position came up at Nature, which is the journal that I work at now. I work on the journalism side of Nature. I don't deal with the peer-reviewed manuscripts. And I was able to get it, and I think I just was lucky to find my niche, so early on, because it just is this kind of wonderful combination of sort of being half in the academic world, like we're all the science journalists who work at Nature, obviously a bunch of geeks and we love science. So it's sort of semi-academic, and we can go deep, but then I also get to be a writer and a journalist, and so it just has all the things that I love to do, and I've been there ever since. I mean, I've done different roles in the team. I ran the whole newsroom for Nature for a while and so on. And then after a while, I started going even deeper and doing books as well. So this is my second book.
Oh, and that's a big change, isn't it? Going from writing, whether you are doing long form pieces or you're doing kind of shorter explainer pieces, going from even long form journalism to a full length book is night and day, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really really hard. I mean, I'm sure everybody you speak to who speaks about books says how very difficult it is. I mean, even I actually sort of specialize in doing feature stories, really for Nature, which is
Mhm.
like 3-4 pages. It's still a big deep dive, but you might do that in 2 or 3 weeks with maybe, I don't know, a dozen interviews, let's say. Whereas with the book, it's gone over like 5 years. I think I've probably done well over 200 interviews by this point. So it's just trying to kind of synthesize that level of information, and particularly with this book, I mean, it was just so hard because I went into all these different fields that I'd never been in before. I mean, I trained
Mm.
in like biomedicine and genetics, and then I started, and we can talk about this, but I looked at like the history of evidence-based medicine, and I'm sort of reasonably comfortable there. But then I sort of followed this evidence lead into all these other fields which were embracing evidence, and interviewing policymakers and people in conservation and policing. And I went to Scotland Yard in London to talk to this person who was leading evidence-based policing. So going into all those different fields was sort of fascinating, challenging, amazing, but also kind of hard to bring all that together into one story, which is what I wanted to do.
Oh, I honestly, I can't imagine. I envy the organizational prowess and really like the patience and the dedication required to first like pitch a book, devise of a concept and pitch that book, put together the proposal and do everything there, but then to redirect and course correct throughout the process, because I can imagine that the finished product, as much as you may have foreseen, what you were hoping to deliver, that you must have changed course and kind of adjusted along the way, right?
Hugely, yeah, and I mean, I've got this. I'm somebody who sort of thinks in spreadsheets, so I've got this like master spreadsheet for my book, which kind of reflects all the multiple times I've gone back and tried to like move all the blocks around and restructure it. And but yes, I mean the first draft was like double the length of the actual book, and that's of course where you need an editor to come in. And my editor was really good at, because I delivered her this awful first draft, and in the hope, of course, that like this was going to be the book. And then you have to have this awful conversation where they say, thanks very much for what you've done, and this is how you need to completely rewrite it. Um, which is when you go away and cry. But she rightly said, which of course I should have seen, which is the way to, as we know as storytellers, I mean, the way to tell any story is through people. And so that is what I've tried to do in the book, is kind of shown how each of these different fields came to embrace evidence, but that's always through the eyes of some person. Often there was a person who realized that this is true in medicine and all these different fields. They kind of looked around them and said, isn't it strange that everything we're doing is based on like anecdote and conventional wisdom, and we're just doing it
Mm.
because it's always been done this way? And then they go, there must be a better way to do this. And then they start realizing that maybe we should actually test what works in, whether drugs work in clinical trials, for example, in medicine. And then they kind of spark this revolution that travels through their field to a greater or lesser extent, because it's traveled to different extents in these different fields. So people's stories, always really the way to anchor things, aren't they?
They really are.
One of the things I realized in writing this book, I think a bit is because it's sort of a story which people know, but it's also not a story that people know. Is I'm not sure that the people who are in all these fields, who are like fighting for evidence-based medicine, or they're trying to transform policing, by using evidence, have been so good at telling their own story.
Hmm.
Because I mean, just when you introduced it, I mean, just the words, evidence-based medicine and evidence-based policy, I mean, most people's eyes glaze over. So, so it's something about turning this into a story that I really want, will help people understand that this has been happening, and that it's kind of entertaining, like much more entertaining and interesting and human than perhaps these dry phrases convey.
Yeah, it's so interesting because for those of us who have sort of existed in science communication or science journalism spaces for a long time, it's become almost I don't want to call it passe, but it's so obvious, right? It's conventional wisdom now that like we have to communicate via story. And as you mentioned, the best way to tell stories is to tell people, like to
Mm.
tell their stories. But on the one hand, it seems so obvious. On the other hand, I can tell you, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you because you've seen it. When we talk about science based, medicine or evidence based policy, uh, generally speaking, every other book about this topic that I've read has been more of a how to guide or more of a, it may be a bit of a like, this is how we know what we know style of writing, but it's so rare that we actually use the approach that we know works, which
Mm.
is tell the stories of the people themselves. And so
Mm.
it's quite obvious and at the same time it's very innovative that you chose to write this book in this way, and of course it's just so much more effective. And so I want to ask you a question before we start diving into some of these stories, and some of your experiences throughout. I love getting a little bit meta and sort of talking about the content of the book while we're also talking about the process of how you made the book. But I wanted to open up a question or a topic to you, pose something to you. I don't want, us to dedicate the whole hour to this, but it's long been an area of interest of mine. And you're just the perfect person to ask because you sort of live at the intersection of science journalism, what we think of as like kind of classic or traditional journalism, with all of the trainings and all of the requirements and the ethical constraints, and then science communication as a field, which I believe is a very different approach. I'm curious if you feel like they're sort of the same thing, if you think there's crossover, or if you make a strong distinction between your role when you are, acting as a science journalist versus when you are communicating science.
Yes, I definitely think there's a difference.
Mm.
In both cases, I think science journalism is a subset of science communication.
Hmm.
In all these cases, we're obviously trying to communicate complex concepts in ways which people find useful or compelling or entertaining. The difference is, I suppose, who we're serving.
Hmm.
The key thing about journalism is that we're not here to be necessarily to be champions of science and scientists.
Right.
We're here to hold
Right.
them to account. Um, and that's an absolutely crucial distinction, I think. So, if it's a science communication press release from a university, it's because the university really wants to promote its own research. Whereas if I'm going to report on that study, I'm going to say, well, is that a good piece of research? And who might critique that? So that's ultimately, I think, the difference. And we're trying to serve, we're also, of course, trying to serve our audiences. We want them to gain something from that themselves. It's in the public interest, right?
Yeah, yeah. I would fully agree with that. I find that um, a lot of the confusion and a lot of the sort of, I guess, infighting that we can see. I don't want to call it infighting, but the disagreements that we sometimes see within the ranks often do come when we're talking about that the crux of the issue, which you just mentioned, which is that journalists' role is sort of educating the public and calling to task, bringing sort of things into the daylight. And so very often it's about holding scientists to account. It's about ensuring that, the science that we are learning from is done ethically and it's done, whatever, all the different
Mm-hmm.
things. Whereas you're right, science communication, there is a certain, I guess, level of advocacy in the
Yes.
role of a science communicator that journalists simply, it would be unethical for you to take that tack.
Yes, but I also think I think it's a bit important for us as journalists not to end up being, snobby about science communicators. Do you see what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Like we're some higher form. Well, we're not. We're all trying to to sort of help people. I mean, if you're putting out a press release, as I said, at a university, you're still trying to put out some useful information, I hope.
Hmm.
So yeah, I would worry if those definitions ended up creating some kind of divide
Right.
in the community. You know, we serve our different purposes, and I think that's important to acknowledge.
And I wonder too if your perspective on this, which is, I think, like a very amicable and understanding, like it's empathic, kind of to both roles, really is because you were trained as a scientist first. And I love interviewing science journalists and science communicators because their stories are so varied. Some of them started in J school, like they've been
Mm.
journalists from day one, and then they just, got bit by a science bug and really focus their attention and the energy more and more in developing expertise in certain scientific aspects of journalism. And then others, like yourself, and to some extent, when I was working more in SciComm, I was the same way. I was much more academic to begin with. And then I found that I like doing the communication about the science more than I like doing the science
Mm.
itself. And that was sort of my path. And it is interesting how those paths can influence our perceptions of I guess the role that we take within this multifaceted field. So,
Yeah, and I've found, you know, I mean, I'm
mhm,
quite jealous of the science journalists who went through journalism school and actually learned those skills professionally rather than learning them all on the job as I did. And I've
mhm,
learned so much from working with them. You know, I think we like in the Nature News team, we tend to have come through that. You know, some have come through the science path and some have come through the journalism path, but we're all ultimately trying to be professional journalists. Um, so I think again, we bring different things to the table. I mean, you asked about whether, you know, training in science makes me approach things in a particular way. I mean,
mhm,
I don't know about you, but when I interview people, which of course I do all the time, I never really reveal that I might have a background in science. I mean, partly because the PhD I did was highly specialised and is completely irrelevant to what I report on today. But also, you know, people immediately assume you know too much if you start, you know, saying, oh, you've
right.
got a PhD. And I don't. I mean, I don't know anything about most of the things I have to report on. So I'd much rather just keep that in the background and think that it gave me a bit of experience of research, which is useful.
Isn't that a funny thing about science is that, I guess the old kind of adage, the old conventional wisdom is that when you first get your undergraduate degree, you know a whole lot about very little. And by the time you're specialized in your PhD, or sorry, the other way around, you know a little bit about a whole lot of things. By the time
Right.
you get your PhD, you know a whole lot about something super narrow. And
Yeah.
to some aspects it does translate, and really I think that the way that it translates the best, and this coming back to the book, I think this is fundamental, is that you know how to read a journal article, you know how to kind of see past spin, or to understand, to the extent that you can within the constraints of your statistical training, blah blah blah, the approaches to the scientific inquiry, the way that people are writing about their field of science. But you're right. Like if you're trained in biomedical sciences and genetics, I was trained in psychology and neurobiology. That doesn't make me an expert on reading a chemistry paper or a theoretical astrophysics paper. It maybe I can read a journal article better than somebody who doesn't have like who's never been exposed to reading journal articles, but I still have no expertise in that area. So you had to do that. I mean, you have to do that every day for your job, but you also had to do that for this book. Not only read these sort of expert positions. I don't want to say opinions because that's the whole point here, right? But the expert positions of these investigators, but also dig deep, interview them, and learn from them how we know what we know. And I mean, that's a major component of this, right? It's not just about saying this is what we know, believe me, or just integrate this into your perspective and your frame of reference and let's all start from the same position. It's this is how we know what we know.
Right. You know, I mean, and that's, in a way, that was what you're talking about was kind of a driving force for me personally for the whole book, is to better myself
Mm,
understand these different, you know, sources of evidence. I mean, you know, in my PhD, I didn't do medical training. I think I would have learned a lot more about, randomized controlled trials and observational studies if I'd been down that path. But I studied basic, discovery science, and so that's been a kind of huge motivator for me. I mean, I feel like I've emerged from this like a much, selfishly, just a much stronger kind of science journalist, because now I can understand the differences that perhaps I didn't appreciate before. When people are talking to me about, how we understand if there's causality there, for example. So, people use, I mean, maybe we can talk about this term evidence, but people use this term evidence in all these different ways. And it's just this huge, sort of this massive umbrella that encompasses all these different types of information. And I feel like I've learned a little bit better. I'm not saying I'm a master of it, but, to understand perhaps some of the strengths and weaknesses of those types of information.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting. I do think it's a good place to start. I mean, we started 20 minutes ago, but to start again, is this word evidence? Because I'll mention two things to sort of guide my perspective, just to help you understand where I'm coming from, so that when you share with us what you mean by evidence and what the book means by evidence, there is some context there. So I work as a psychologist. I did a PhD in clinical psychology, so it is a bit more applied on medical aid in dying. But I did a qualitative PhD, which was so difficult for me because I came from the neurosciences. And so I was like, what is this qualitative work? What hermeneutics and, like all these philosophical approaches to digging deep into people's stories. And how do I translate that into something academic? And then on the flip side of that, I work, on this other podcast, the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And the host of that podcast, Stephen Novella, has made a career championing something called science-based medicine as opposed to evidence-based medicine, simply because he thinks that standard has become not high enough. There are a lot of people within these fields that are championing, the quote unquote evidence that supports chiropractic or naturopathy or all of these things that are actually often debunked within stricter kind of parameters within science. So it's interesting that the word evidence in some ways is used to say, here are our standards and we need to meet these very high standards. And in other aspects, there is quote unquote evidence that can be used to promote pseudoscience, for example. And so it's an interesting threshold or baseline, because the language is always evolving. So I'm curious, when we say, how evidence shows what really works, what was your sort of operational definition of evidence?
Yes. So I did have to define this quite early in the book. And I think it took me about 2 years to work out what I was going to try and talk about. I mean, evidence in general means information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. But as you just said, the term can be used to refer to all types of different information within that, and it's used in different ways in different contexts. And so in the book, I use the term evidence as shorthand for evidence from empirical research, which means information collected by careful observation and experimentation. And I would include in that quantitative and qualitative work.
As I would, yeah.
Yeah. But, there are other types of evidence. I mean, most people, you think of evidence, it's like, well, that's evidence in a court of law, which is just information produced into the court. There's evidence that people accrue based on their own lived experience, which I think probably would fall into the qualitative evidence bucket. And even in science, it's used in these different ways. And in the book, I focus probably mostly on a specific type of empirical evidence, which is evidence of effectiveness. So, like, do we know if something like a drug has an effect or a policy has an effect, which is often based on things like testing it in a randomized trial or on observational studies. But I don't want to be sort of hardline about that. And I would say one kind of consequence of just being in science journalism so long and also then writing the book, I feel much more inclusive towards evidence now. Like I think
Mhm.
maybe like you, I started off being a bit sniffy about qualitative evidence, and now I
Yeah.
don't feel that way at all. I think that, obviously, for example, people's experience. I mean, there's some parts of science that or parts of the world that we can't really understand without just talking to people, and some of that is difficult to put into spreadsheets and quantify. So I feel, yeah, I learned a lot about those different types of evidence. But this confusion about the word is kind of problematic, because when you're talking about people cherry picking evidence or saying, well, chiropractic is supported by evidence, it allows people to to claim that they are evidence based. I think I wrote in the book that attaching evidence based to a term doesn't or to something doesn't magically make it true. Um,
Right.
so we have to dig beyond this idea of just claiming that something is evidence based and saying, okay, well, what evidence are we really talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, we see that obviously we see it in every field. In my experience as a psychologist, one of the common things that I cite, and I did in a book I co-edited about pseudoscience in therapy, is like EMDR is a great example. It is considered an evidence-based treatment by the American Psychological Association, and there are a lot of peer-reviewed journal articles about EMDR, and yet within the field, there are a lot of people who are highly critical that it even has any function at all, and that all of that, evidence, which I don't know if it should be in air quotes or not, is
Mm.
actually, it's just weak. It's weak
Mm-hmm.
evidence, and it's not actually supporting the claims that some of the authors claim that it is supporting. And so it is one of those really interesting things. I can't help but point out that the old adage, skeptics love to, be high and mighty and throw it around and say the plural of anecdote is not data, but I always say when we're talking in the other podcast, I always say, well, sometimes it is. you know, I hear
Right,
what you're saying, right? A collection of a bunch of people saying, I had the experience of being abducted by aliens. If enough people say it, it doesn't make it scientific. But at the
right.
same time, from a qualitative perspective, anecdotal experience, when analyzed with a certain level
Yes,
of rigor, can actually be evidence.
exactly. Yes. Um,
And that's such a tough thing to grapple with, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and it's sort of that. I mean, that problem of like what evidence we're going to count as
Hmm.
evidence is partly why I've just become a huge fan and geek of around evidence synthesis, which is kind of partly like this massive theme that runs through my book, um, which is that's how you bring together a body of conflicting evidence of some strong studies and weak studies and try to make sense of them, which is, scientists do studies, for example, systematic reviews, which are now like the bedrock of evidence on which most modern medicine is based, where they bring together all of the studies which have tested a particular treatment and combine them and carefully weed out the poor ones, rate them for bias, and then say, okay, well, what type of signal emerges from this noise? And I just, I feel like this is this hugely kind of overlooked and fundamentally important part of science, and so important in understanding evidence. And it's so intuitive to say, well, let's not just look at one study. We need to look at all the studies which have answered this question. And that that approach actually has been transformational in medicine. It's being embraced across these other fields as well, as of bringing together the body of knowledge. And but that's how you can start to kind of say, okay, well, let's look at all the evidence for this dodgy sounding treatment. And if all of it is just like, anecdotal or a few, studies of 10 people, then we're like, okay, well, there is a body of evidence here, but it's a weak
Yeah.
body of evidence.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I feel like that has become, in some circles, a new approach to describing, let's say, interventions, where it'll be broken down into, we have not enough evidence versus we have weak evidence,
Exactly.
like low effect sizes,
Yeah.
just kind of like multiple studies that aren't very consistent. And then we have strong evidence. And then I think there's a whole category of, oh, we have very good evidence that it does not work. And I think
Right.
we leave that out a lot. Like when we're having these conversations, there is a big difference between we just don't know enough about this yet versus no, we have a lot of information on this. And that information pretty solidly tells us that it doesn't do what people are claiming it does, but it persists because there is some sort of agenda.
Or because it's been done for I mean, I have examples in the book of this. It's been done for forever. I mean, you can look across all these different fields and find these examples of conventional wisdom. I mean, I was looking at things like performance appraisals in the workplace, which are just done because we've always done them. But if you look at the evidence that supports them, it's actually rather weak that it does anything for performance. So that's the inertia that you're trying to get over.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those different categories because I'm so curious. Some of the things that you discovered the journalism that you did for this book, sort of, there's that weak category like we mentioned, but what about the obvious category of we have a lot of evidence out there and the evidence points to the fact that it's simply whatever the conventional wisdom is or the narrative is that is being pushed, for whatever reason, it just straight up doesn't work. Like we're in debunking territory now, but people still persist in their beliefs. Did you come across a lot of topics in your book that fall into that category?
I mean, performance appraisals was one. I mean, the difficulty when I get asked that question is that
Mhm.
like I don't want to become the person who goes, oh well, it's really complicated.
But isn't that your role? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's always is the case though. I mean,
Mhm.
it's not often the case that of course we have something where it's absolutely cut and dried, that we're still doing it, and actually it's kind of awful. I think there are good historical examples. I mean, I can tell you an awful one from the past, which if you want to hear that story,
Yes,
um,
please.
which I sort of opened the book with because if you start talking about evidence to most people, then their eyes glaze over. So I was like, okay, well, I need to have a good example that shows why this might actually be a good thing to do. And the example is around. Okay, the example stems. It's an example of where anecdotal advice had absolutely tragic consequences, and this
Mm.
goes back to the book Baby and Childcare, which was by the paediatrician Benjamin Spock. I don't know if you've come across this story before,
Hmm.
but he produced like the best-selling parenting book of all time. It flew off the shelves. It spread around the world, and in the 1958 edition, he made this small change to the text, where before he had been saying that babies should be laid to sleep on their backs, and he instead switched it and said. He recommended that babies should be laid to sleep on their fronts, and he suggested that this was because babies were likely, if they were on their backs, to choke on their own vomit or to get sort of flat heads, basically. And he wasn't the
Mhm.
only one. That was the general advice, sort of changed at that time. It seems to have had an effect because parents' behaviour did change. There was a rise in front sleeping, and then meanwhile there was this sort of sinister change going on in the medical literature showing this rise in sudden infant death syndrome. Um, and no one really knew why this was. And I'm not saying it should have been obvious. Of course, it wasn't obvious at all. There were many possible factors that could have been behind that. And people were hypothesizing about why this change was happening and why these babies were dying. And what was kind of missing from this conversation was some actual careful studies, which
Yeah.
what was needed to be done was these case control studies where you go, okay, let's look at children who've died and compare them to a similar group who have not, and let's try and tease out these factors that might be responsible. And when those studies started coming through, which was starting around 1970, the first ones, there was a small signal, and it took until the 1980s basically for it to become very clear that there was this link between front sleeping for babies and risk of sudden infant death syndrome. And then it still took some years actually for that to be kind of to filter through to changes, recommended changes. And then once the change of advice happened, then this was the most convincing evidence of all, actually, that front sleeping was linked to sudden infant death syndrome, was that the death rate sort of dropped like a stone once parents were being advised to lay their children to sleep on their backs. And the
Yeah.
sort of the the reason I used that in the front of the book was there was this. It also showed the power of evidence synthesis. I was just talking about systematic reviews because later on, this research group went back and said, okay, well, these studies were coming out looking at causes of SIDS. At what point should we have seen from the data that there was a link? So they went back and they kind of synthesized these studies as they came out one by one. And they realized that I think it was after only the first two studies had come out, which was around 1970, if those studies had been pooled and synthesized, the signal was quite clear, actually, that there was a risk of front sleeping. And they calculated that something like 50,000 children probably lost their lives because that hadn't been done. And again, it's easy to, of course, to look back with hindsight, and the practice of evidence synthesis wasn't so common then, but I think that was described as the most lethal piece of unsubstantiated advice in the history of child health, and you can see why, right? So I just think that it really captures all of the things that perhaps we're trying to say when we talk about evidence and the dangers. There can be real dangers in following anecdotal advice that sometimes we're not aware of.
Absolutely, and I think it also goes to sort of the power, not to get too in the weeds, but the power of whether it be graduate students or PIs who are working in labs, or just whatever the role may be, of taking on the maybe sometimes thankless work of endeavoring to do a large systematic review or a large meta-analysis, of trying to say, I want to look at all of the literature that is available on this topic and really dig deep into the quality of that literature and compare these different outcomes of these studies and say, what is the state of our knowledge about this specific question or this specific topic? It's such an important thing to do in the sciences. Luckily, we do see it done, and we see it done, often, but it's not always an easy thing to do, is it?
No, and it's not really valued very much within science.
It's I think new information, right?
No, exactly. And I mean, if you speak to people who are endeavouring to do these systematic reviews, which, by the way, at least until it's changing because AI tools are coming along, but I mean, it can take 2 years to do a systematic review. Some of them take 8. They're just enormously complex studies, and what gets you the sort of kudos and the promotion? Well, it's doing a brand new study, isn't it? It's not really taking the time to synthesize all the studies which have been done before, which is a shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, many people say it's kind of undervalued given the importance that it has.
Well, and the same thing with, the kind of point that I was making before, which is the debunking, right? The saying like, okay, maybe this thing, the evidence isn't very strong, or, hey, we actually have evidence that opposes this thing. Because oftentimes when scientists find, negative outcomes of their studies, they are discouraged from publishing them. Journals aren't making a lot of space for negative results. It's not an interesting story to tell, and there's a big disincentive within the scientific community to keep going down that path. But it's insane to me, because it's basically not only improving our knowledge of, what really works, but it's also helping people not reinvent the wheel over and over.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean that's a kind of widely discussed problem in science is that negative results don't tend to be published as much as positive ones, which gives this kind of skew to the scientific literature. And people who do really, rigorous, high stakes systematic reviews in medicine, I mean, they're going to go to enormous lengths to writing to scientists individually in order to kind of, smoke out those studies, which the negative results which are sitting in somebody's file drawer, which is why those studies are so laborious and intensive.
How much for your book is that something that you discussed with, in these over 200 interviews, is not just like what we know, but what we don't know, or what we know not to be true? Because I feel like that's such an important conversation to be had when it comes to our discussion of evidence, right? Like, the book is called Beyond Belief, How Evidence Shows What Really Works. And implied in that, I think, is also like what doesn't work.
Absolutely. And I mean, I write in the, so if you look at policies, in social policy, so, do government programs work, or whatever the government policy might be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wrote in that part of the book, there's this thing called the 80% rule, which is that 80% of things just don't work. 80% of policies, I mean, this is probably true across fields, whatever it is, whatever intervention you're trying, whether it's a teaching technique, probably in health as well, that 80% of things don't work. Now, we don't necessarily know that because, I mean, certainly in policies, most policies have probably never been rigorously tested. So there's just a vast amount of stuff which is going on, which has just never, really been tested, and that's what all these evidence champions I write about are trying to change.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about kind of that storytelling component. How did you go about choosing who you would talk to, choosing, what to highlight in the book? Because it's I can't imagine that there's a playbook for this, for how to tell a story about how we know what we know, how we know what works based on the available evidence, and who are the important people to go to learn more about that.
Sure. I mean, I originally wrote the book because I met one of the people who is a man called Ian Chalmers, who's this pioneering doctor, researcher, who I interviewed for my last book, actually. And my last book was about observational studies, these huge, longitudinal studies that have tracked generations of children growing up in Britain. And he had sort of become actually frustrated with observational studies, and became very enamoured by randomised controlled trials. I mean, to speak to your point, and then I'll come back and tell his story.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just journalistic skills, isn't it? Because once you've interviewed 5 people in a field, and then they all say, well, you really need to go and speak to Ian Chalmers in medicine, or you must talk to Lawrence Sherman in policing, because that's the person who has really championed this approach.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I do that there is a danger, of course, in telling one person's stories, because then we perpetuate this idea that these things happen just through individual people, and of course, often these things snowball into movements. So I did sometimes have to choose the people whose stories I want to tell. But to go back to medicine, which I think is a kind of fascinating and quite amusing story, because the interesting thing about the kind of origins of evidence-based medicine was that really you had it sort of emerging in 2 different parts of the world at once. So in the UK, we had Ian Chalmers, and in the US, there was a really central character called David Sackett. And both of these people had in common was that they were training in hospitals in the kind of sort of late 50s, 60s, and they realised when they looked around, they were sort of getting frustrated in medical practice, because they were realising that the doctors would give out different advice for the same problem. So, for example, Ian Chalmers was working in an obstetrics and gynecology ward, and he realised, well, one doctor would say that this woman needs a cesarean section, and another doctor would say something different. And one doctor's really into bed rest in pregnancy, and one isn't. And so in both these cases, the doctors were becoming frustrated and like, well, what are we supposed to believe here? Like, which treatment is best? And both of them, in different ways, stumbled on randomized controlled trials and became very enamored with the scientific approach to actually test whether a treatment is effective and to work out which treatment is best. And then they both, in their individual ways, began to kind of champion that approach. And so Ian Chalmers in the UK, he decided to go with the sort of synthesis approach, and decided to synthesize all of the evidence that was known around what's actually effective in pregnancy and childbirth, and produced these pioneering books in the 80s with hundreds of systematic reviews in them, which actually showed that, like, some really quite degrading practices, like shaving women's pubic hair routinely in childbirth, there was no evidence to support that this would be beneficial. And kind of exposed all of these practices, and then went on to found a group that you've probably heard of, which is called the Cochrane Collaboration, which continues to put out very, very high standard systematic reviews in medicine, to show what works across lots of different fields now. And then on the other side of the ocean, we had David Sackett, who was clearly a kind of he was a rebel. I mean, this is what I love about these stories, is that often the people who have driven evidence in their fields are kind of a bit maverick, they're a bit sort of rebellious and they had to be, because they are challenging the way things are done, right? So,
Right.
so for example, when David Sackett encounters randomized controlled trials and realizes that most people around him are practicing what's now sometimes called eminence-based medicine, which is just doing what the most senior doctor in the room says. He,
Oh no, that's awful.
I know. And there's another acronym I really love, which is GOBSAT, which stands for good old boys sat around the table, just kind of pontificating about what to do. Anyway,
oh God, we know it well. Yeah.
Yeah. So he encounters randomized trials and then just goes off and I mean, I called him in the book a real pain in the ass, because he just starts challenging doctors everywhere. And then he went on and moved to McMaster University and pioneered this whole approach to teaching medicine, where rather than students being told what to do, this is the problem, your patient's got a black toe, so you're going to do this. The students would be told, okay, well, this is your problem. We're not going to tell you what to do. You have to go and find the evidence, which is about a sort of problem-solving approach. And this evolved into an approach that was christened evidence-based medicine only in 1991. And that's actually one of the most remarkable things that made me want to write the book, which is realization that the approach sort of evolved over sort of 70s, 80s, but the actual term evidence-based medicine was only used in the literature in 1991, which is 35 years ago, which is kind of extraordinary to realize that this approach, which we just, of course medicine is based on science, right? Is actually, it's very recent. And it swept around the world very quickly in the 90s, and now is the predominant way in which Western medicine is practiced.
And so I'm curious about sort of, the other side of this coin, taken to its extreme, because this is, I guess, an inflection point or a sticking point very often between myself and my colleagues when we talk about evidence-based approaches. Medicine, I think, is a good example. But again, because my field is psychology, I'm in one of these like weird fields where you can't do randomized controlled trials all the time. It just doesn't make sense from a ethical perspective, and human beings aren't, cloned lab mice. So there are some things you can do and some things you can't do. And not to take too much time and to concisely make this argument, which I've made before on the show, I worry sometimes that in fields like psychology, what we think of as gold standard approaches are simply the things that are the easiest to study. We end up doing RCTs, or we end up having these gold standard evidence-based, very often CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy treatments, because they can be so readily manualized, because we can, train people up to do them very easily and say, look, after 6 weeks, these were our results, they're measurable, and let's just do these things. And it leaves out a lot of the more nuanced approaches. I practice from an existential perspective. There's not a lot of evidence in this aspect of psychology, simply because it's actually really hard to study by definition. And so I'm curious how you've grappled, maybe, in the book, but also broader as a science journalist, with that question of, is sometimes the evidence that we have the best available, description of reality simply because it is the easiest thing to study? And what do we do with the stuff that's more in the gray area?
Yeah, I think that's one of many criticisms of the evidence-based approach. And I don't, one of my concerns with the book is I don't want to come across as this kind of naive evidence advocate, like evidence, has all the answers, because of course it doesn't. So one criticism is definitely that, and that's not just in medicine. That's been seen in, let's say, in international development as well, that we're just testing the things that we can test, right? And so there's all this other sphere of approaches that could be taken that are just much more difficult to test in a randomized trial. And one criticism of the evidence-based approach in lots of fields, including medicine, is it gives this idea that evidence from randomized trials is superior to all other forms of evidence.
Right.
When clearly it's not, because sometimes, many times, randomized trials can be wrong, or they can be poorly done. Sometimes you don't need to do a randomized trial because actually the approach just very obvious, the intervention is so obviously effective that we don't need to put it through that test. I mean, you're talking about fields where it's difficult to do. With public health, again, it's quite difficult to do randomized trials of great big kind of public health campaigns. So I suppose this goes back to where we started. I mean, I sort of perhaps mellowed or became more inclusive in my feelings about evidence as I went through this, of understanding that, the types of evidence you're going to draw on is going to depend on what you want to test and whether, what type of experiments you're able to do.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not easy making that determination, is it? Like, I'm curious if some of the folks that you interviewed, if that was one of the topics that you grappled with, was like, how do we choose how we investigate these things, and how do we maybe describe to the general public not so much this thing is true versus this thing is not true, because I think scientists are always a little bit concerned and careful about saying 100%, I proved this thing. But how do we communicate confidence or risk, or these sort of more nuanced approaches to saying this is how we know what we know, and it's conditionally changing all the time as we learn new things.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a big conversation at the moment amongst scientists. I mean, interestingly, I'm literally reporting at the moment a sort of a piece related to my book, but different, around trust in science. Whether there's concerns about trust in science, whether it's declining, but also how you might boost it. But this, I mean, I did report a little bit on this also when I was looking. I looked a bit around how to speak to somebody who has concerns about vaccine hesitancy. And I would say, having reported on that and maybe other fields, one message that does seem to come across is that being transparent about uncertainties is much more persuasive to people than trying to give a very, clear that this is just what we know message, and this is what you ought to do. So I think that makes sense to me, of being open about the flaws and the difficulties and the uncertainties and the changing nature of evidence. It seems really important to do that.
I agree. I think that very often we underestimate the I don't know, one of my kind of mantras in science communication was always like, never underestimate the intelligence of your audience, but always underestimate their vocabulary. Like, I think a lot of times we conflate people's eyes glazing over when we use scientific language with an inability to understand procedural concepts. And we think that people just want to know, here's a thing, just know it, right? Here's a thing, just believe me and take it, take it on faith, as opposed to, well, let's think about this for a few minutes and figure out why we know it. I think that we've seen a huge change, right, in the way that we teach science at the sort of undergraduate and graduate level. But there is still some holdover of like, you just need to learn all this stuff and just take my word for it. And I don't think that lends itself to good critical thinking. Do you?
No, of course not. I mean, interestingly, that's why David Sackett, who I was talking about earlier, became really frustrated. One of the reasons, because he was just being taught these facts, and it didn't really help him solve problems. So yes, I feel like science communication and has moved beyond the like, let's just teach everyone a bunch of facts and then send them off into the world and hope for the best. I think it's all about sort of being able to think critically and understanding people's questions and concerns, not dismissing people for having questions around whatever it might be. Those come from a valid place. One thing I think I learned from reporting on this and speaking to people who know much more about evidence is just this sort of importance of of humility when it comes to evidence. It can be wrong, it changes. And the other thing that's really important, I think, to say, and this is true across all these fields that I've looked at, is they all reach this realization that evidence is one factor in making a final decision. Like in medicine, I give this example in the book, which came from some of the people I interviewed. But we know that an antibiotic is going to clear up a bacterial infection. But you have to, it doesn't mean you're automatically going to give the antibiotic to every patient who's got the bacterial infection. It depends what they want. If someone's at the
Right.
end of their life and they've chosen that they don't want to be treated anymore, of course you're going to respect their wishes. So the evidence of effectiveness is exactly the same. But we have to value in medicine, it said you have to bring in the values and preferences of the patient. Of course you do. And in policy, this is one of the criticisms of evidence-based policy, is that evidence might show you what works, but it doesn't tell you whether you should implement that approach. You have
Yeah.
to factor in politics and societal values and cost and all these other things. So I think of it more, partly because I came across this in one of the books I was reading, but it's more like a pie chart of like all the factors that you're going to have on the table when you make a decision, and evidence is going to be one of the slices of the pie, hopefully.
Yeah, and I mean that is a that and I guess it goes to show the importance of this multidisciplinary approach to communicating and basically deciding these really important paths to take, whether we're talking about public policy, political science, economics, medicine, psychology, any of these different fields, the stakeholders involved. Yes, we want to take an evidence-based approach, of course, because we all need to be starting from as close an approximation of reality as possible, right? We know
Mm-hmm.
we know that science helps us to get closer and closer to understanding the nature of existence, but we are still kind of constantly modeling and approximating. We want to always start from that place so that then we can make decisions based on all sorts of different factors. But if we're not actually starting from a place of evidence, then we're breaking the chain downstream. Like, we have to know what works to then be able to say, how can we implement this in a way, or what do we choose to implement in a way that is, healthy and promotes whatever, public, the greatest public good. But if we don't have the evidence to begin with, or the evidence is there, but we just choose to ignore it, we're already sort of handicapping our approach.
Well, a lot of people don't like the term evidence-based because it assumes what you just said, that that's the basis for the decision. They prefer to use
Mm,
evidence-informed, which is and that's probably where I don't necessarily use that term, but I do have some sympathy with that, because you're assuming that there is evidence showing what works, and in a lot
right,
of
that makes
these cases,
sense.
there just isn't. You've got some knowledge out there of some type, and I think it's good to again to have that as it's one of the things we want to have on the table in the discussion, let's say in the policy making discussion. But it may not give a clear steer. But I think what I would argue for, and I think a lot of people would argue for, is that at least it should be part of the conversation. If it doesn't even appear on the table, then that seems a lost opportunity, that we're not even using the knowledge that exists.
Right, because a lot of this knowledge does exist, doesn't it? Like, there are, I think, probably a surprising number of areas where people go, huh, I wonder, why X, Y, and Z. I wonder if anybody's ever asked that question. It's like, yeah, people have asked that question, and they published like a whole pool of
Yeah.
literature on it. And yet
Well,
somehow there's a huge disconnect between what academics know and what, the policymakers know, for
and,
example.
and that and that is absolutely what I found looking at these different fields. I mean, education
Mm.
is a classic one. I mean, another one is management and business, which we can come on to in a minute. But there are like hundreds of randomized trials and lots of other studies which look at the most effective approaches for helping children learn. That's incredibly valuable form of knowledge. Which is being used more and more. I mean, I think actually the UK is kind of leading the way a bit here, because there's a group which is helping synthesize some of that knowledge into a form by which it can be used by head teachers to make spending decisions.
Mm.
But a lot of the difference in some of these fields. So let's look at medicine for a minute. I think the reason that evidence-based medicine took off, one of the reasons it took off, and became embedded in the field, is because it was birthed in a medical school. So students were coming in, they were learning this approach. This was at McMaster in Canada. and then they were taking it with them into practice. So it's like teaching people as they are learning their skills is really important. Now you look at something like teaching, it's not necessarily common, or in some cases doesn't happen at all, that you would be taught that there's this huge body of knowledge that can actually show the most effective ways to help children learn, right? And the same is true in policing. Again, that's sort of starting to change as these evidence movements sort of expand. And then business and management, which is kind of really interesting going into that field, in that they were like, there's huge amounts of knowledge around how to run an effective team, and kind of organizational psychology and things, which doesn't really reach the everyday manager who's just been promoted into their position, right? Who's never been trained in management anyway.
Yeah.
So I think that point you're identifying, of this gulf between the research which is being done and the people who could actually benefit from using it, that I observed across lots of different fields.
Oh, that's interesting. And I can imagine, or at least I question whether one of the other reasons that we see a sort of, I guess, public appreciation of science-based or evidence-based or evidence-informed medicine sort of above and beyond, or maybe before, we could say, policy, for example, or like education, is because by some metrics, I think people perceive the stakes to be higher. Like, we definitely are a cover your ass culture. And I think that there is a real concern. Hey, if you're not treating my cancer based on the most up-to-date, breaking knowledge that we have in medicine, I'm getting short shrift here, and I'm paying a lot of money for this treatment, and my life depends on it. As opposed to some of these other fields where we could take the exact same approach, but we choose not to because we don't feel, I guess, the pressure the same kind of way. I wonder how much that plays into it.
Well,
That's kind of an
I'm not
open
sure
question.
I'm not sure it's a feeling. That's actually to do with accountability and regulation. In medicine, if you don't use evidence-based clinical guidelines and somebody is harmed, not only can they take you to court, but you could be struck off the medical register and no longer be able to held to practice. So professional
Right.
bodies will hold you to account. Now that doesn't really happen in other fields. So if
Right.
you don't use evidence to the best evidence-based approach to save natterjack toads on the coastlines of Britain, nobody's really going to do anything about that. Nobody either notices or cares. And similarly, let's say in schools, obviously everybody cares that children learn, but there's no real accountability or necessarily measurement of outcomes to say, well, you should have been using this other approach, and if you had done, my children might have learned more.
Yeah.
So that to me is the difference, I think.
And so, sort of as we're approaching the end of our hour, I've kept you longer than I even said that I would. I'm curious about the top line here. It's such a big topic. How do we know what we know? How does evidence show what actually works versus the places where we have a lack of evidence, or we have weak evidence, or we actually have evidence to show what doesn't work? What are you hoping with, the 5 years of work that you put into this? And that's on top of, an entire career's worth of developing the skills to be able to write a book like this. What are you hoping that the reader, who is a member of the public, this is not an academic book, it's a trade book. So what are you hoping that the reader is really able to walk away with? Is it about a new way of thinking? Is it about developing their own critical thinking skills? How are you hoping to reach people?
Yeah, all of those. I want them to just enjoy reading the story, because I think it's really entertaining and fresh, and most people don't know it. But I really want it to be empowering, actually, because I certainly emerged from this feeling quite empowered to understand and use evidence, or sometimes not to use it, actually, if it's unclear. And I would really like readers to get that. And at the end of the book, I've actually put these kind of evidence hacks that will help people, if they want to just start to think critically, and the most basic one is literally just asking for evidence. We have to help people ask questions if they encounter this claim on social media. The first thing that you can do is just say, well, I wonder what the evidence is behind that. And then I've offered some other ways that you might go, okay, well, if there is some evidence, is that, does that look to be reliable? So I want people to feel kind of inspired to see that all of these fields got changed. I think my editor actually described it this way, but what often happens is somebody was frustrated with the way things were being done, and then this light bulb goes on. They're like, oh, evidence could help us do more of the things that work and less of the things that don't, and it can make the world a better place. So I would really love more people to kind of read the book and go, oh, actually the light bulb's gone on for me too, and maybe evidence could help me, and here are some ways that I can start to do it.
Well, I can't tell you how grateful we are for the amount of work that you have put into this, for taking on this labor of, I'm assuming love, but also possibly pain and suffering, to be able to not just share these really impactful and important stories that hopefully will, change people's perspectives, get them thinking a little bit more, get them kind of engaging with that critical side of our thought, but also delivering some tools so that folks have them in their toolkit. I think now more than ever, this is necessary, because now more than ever, we are navigating healthcare systems, educational systems, public policy that is more complex, that requires more kind of strategic approaches where the experts have more narrow expertise and the consumer or the citizen is feeling sometimes more and more lost, but also we're existing in a background that is increasingly authoritarian and increasingly anti-science. And so we know that in many cases, the powers that be are not promoting this type of thinking. We have to find the strength, the courage, and the opportunity to bone up on our own. And so it's just such an important time to be sharing this message. And I'm so grateful, A, for the fact that you wrote this book, but B, that you spent this quality time with us today to inform us about it.
Well, thank you so much. I loved answering your questions. So thank you for having me on.
I'm so glad. So everyone, the book is Beyond Belief, How Evidence Shows What Really Works by Dr. Helen Pearson. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.